sad thing is, because they were remanded in custody for the hearing. In the hearing, because there was no body, no crime could be proved, so the case was dismissed. End of. But quite an interesting case for Superintendent Blanchard. There is another one here which I won't read to you. Basically it says the same sort of thing. Taylor said, oh no, I've nothing whatever to do with it. They couldn't prove anything. So, that's quite an interesting case, and that's the only alleged murder I've got around these parts. Plenty of really nasty accidents and a few suicides, but that's the only alleged murder we've got, and it happened down the road from here. Now, Superintendent Blanchard, his interest does not stop there, because this was in the paper late that year. Police Superintendent Blanchard of Settle, Yorkshire, has been accidentally shot by Superintendent Haynes while returning from shooting. The injured man has since died. So you can't notice that and not investigate further, can you? Tragic affair at Ingleton. Police superintendent killed. The inhabitants of Ingleton district have been, and of several towns in the West Riding, have been shocked by a tragic affair in which 2 police superintendents were concerned. On Friday afternoon, Police Superintendent Haynes of Ingleton and Police Superintendent Blanchard of the Settle Division were out shooting at Ingleton. By some means, the gun of Mr. Haynes went off, and the charge lodged in the groin of Mr. Blanchard, ouch, who died late last night. The inquest was held on Saturday afternoon. William Ingham, the manager of Landcliffe Mill, identified the body. He and the deceased were great personal friends, and he had not the very slightest suspicion of foul play or negligence in any way. The deceased had always spoken of Mr. Haynes as one of his warmest friends. They were both in the act of turning when his gun went off. He could not tell how it happened. He was carrying the gun under his arm, and it went off, striking Superintendent Blanchard in the bottom of the back. He was about 5 or 6 yards away. Dixon was near to Superintendent Blanchard, who said, "I am done, I am done." He died about... Excuse me, why are you laughing? He died about 10:45 at Bradergarth Farm, which you may know where it is, from the effects of the shot. You know where it is, Margaret? You do. He was with him for an hour before they could get assistance. He gave him his pocketbook and wrote in it, "It was a pure accident, no one was to blame." Signed, Blanchard. And at the end, the jury found the verdict of death for misadventure and expressed great sympathy with the widow and family, and also with Mr. Haynes. Now, can you remember the inscription on that gravestone?
In life we are in death.
In the midst of life and death. And also, who paid for the gravestone? This gravestone was paid for by fellow police superintendents. I should damn well think so. Deary me. So poor old Blanchard, you get your money's worth on his life story, don't you? Anyway, so that was that. Terrible accident. His widow moved to Halifax, and his son worked in the civil service, and their daughter married a farm labourer and lived in Leeds. Right, now then, some of you will not forgive me if I don't just whiz through Mr. Mansur, the Mansur family. Now, a lot of you know the Mansurs, and I'm not going to go anywhere near the information that you know. This is just a brief summary, and you'll see why I've had to mention him later on. Now, there are 2 accounts for James Mansur that I've read, and many thanks to Brian for a very comprehensive one. Both of them say that he was apprenticed to a chap called Richard Parsons. So when he came to Rathmell as a carpenter, here he is, he's just come to Rathmell, and here he is a carpenter. Look who he's living with. Who is he a lodger with? Francis Green the shoemaker. He crops up everywhere, doesn't he? So yeah, that's who he's living with at the time. He's probably just finished his apprenticeship here. This is all around the time that the Methodist Church was being built, and we know from the deeds for the Methodist Church that he was one of the people that contributed to the cost of building the Methodist Church, and continued to do a lot with the Methodist Church through his life. He's a good man. So there he is, living with Francis. As I said, he was apprenticed to Richard Parsons. I've read 2 separate accounts that say he was apprenticed to Richard Parsons. So naturally, I want to find out who Richard Parsons is. I can tell you for free, there was nobody in Rathmell called Richard Parsons at that time. That's a lie, there was, but he was 1 year old. And I don't really think he could be doing an apprenticeship. I suspect, can you remember right at the beginning of the First first off, we met a chap called William Parsons. William Parsons took over Millgate House. William Parsons' father was called Richard Parsons. Maybe he continued to call himself Richard Parsons because his father had the same business. Maybe he carried it on, just called himself Richard. But his actual name was William Parsons. He did have a son, the 1-year-old called Richard Parsons, who took over his business later on and worked alongside James Manser. Anyway, all carpenters and worked fine. And after his apprenticeship, he set up his business in his own account. He married a girl called Mary Fletcher of Settle, who I think we've got. Oh yes, there they are, it's in the papers. They've got married, which is all very nice, and 2 sisters married 2 brothers, which is all jolly. No, not at all. 2 sisters got married on the same day. His wife, Mary, had worked as a servant for the Geldards. So it all sort of ties up together, and they had 7 children, and they were obviously connected with the Wesleyan Church and spent a lot of their life working there. They actually lived at Chapel Cottage opposite the Methodist Church. You know, there's little cottages just up. That's where they set off. Before they bought the sawmill up Capel Sideway, and this wonderful picture is on the website, which is the picture of the sawmill as was. Say again.
If you go up the school, past the school,
Yes.
and on,
Yes.
it's up there, isn't it? Yeah.
Well, I'm glad you said that because I wasn't completely sure. Yes.
Because that's where the pond was, wasn't it? Yeah.
Yes. Yes. And so, what a wonderful picture that is. And that's where he stayed for the rest of his time. And his sons were helping him out in the business. One of the sons was a blacksmith. In 1879, they had a fire at the sawmill, and a measure of his popularity was that people in the community actually coughed up the money to help him get himself back on his feet, because of the damage was so great at the sawmill, which was wonderful. And he worked for the Geldards at Capelside as well, along with the junior Richard Parsons as well, and they did all sorts of work to the buildings and the greenhouses and the carriage houses and all the rest of it. The Mansers feature heavily in the graveyard. There's several graves for them, unsurprisingly. James and Mary, his son James, with his son James's first wife Jane Ann Catstick, and then son James and his second wife, who was Maggie Taylor. So they all feature in the graveyard. There's also in the graveyard William's son Robert had a wife called Sarah Alice, who's buried, but she hasn't got a stone. There were several other Mansers as well. James had a sister called Margaret, who never married. She spent 30 years in service to Thomas Pickover at Grange Hall in Gisborne. He was 40 years older than she was, but after he died, he let her live there for many years. Margaret just came over just a few years before she died, presumably so that family could look after her. Also is buried in the graveyard is James's brother John, who worked as a sailcloth weaver in Stockton-on-Tees, which is pretty amazing. He had a brother called Robert George Manser, who slightly got into trouble when he was 25 for rioting in Settle with several other people. The newspaper article doesn't mention him, but the actual criminal records mention Robert's name alongside this Joseph Cubitt and 10 others charged with riotously and tumultuously assembling with others in the number of 12 or more at Giggleswick. So he obviously got a little bit carried away. And then James had a sister called Jane Manser. Does any of you have the card for Jane Manser? Right, so he's got a sister called Jane Manser. Now it just so happens in the small world of Rathmell that Jane would further down the road marry none other than William Parsons. So it's not surprising that Jane's got an apprenticeship with William Parsons if he was actually his brother-in-law. It all ties up, doesn't it? So that's the way it looks. And William and Jane had 10 children, so they win the Procreation Award for this evening. And there are also many, many Parsons graves in the graveyard as well. And remember, this is the family that lived at Millgate House after Henry Clark and Betsy Battersby and that lot as well. So Eventually they retired to live over Bentham direction, but several of them buried in the churchyard. They had a son called Robert who married Alice Franklin of the Franklin family as well. So obviously moving in good circles. Anyway, the reason I've had to mention those is I know you know lots more about the Mansers and there's lots of information out there, which is one of the reasons I don't do them in detail, because I can't possibly pick all of that up, you know, not knowing, but you know them, which is the important thing. But Manser is such an unusual name, you can't help but think, wow, that's just a fantastic name. If you follow any Manser, well, all the ones that I found anyway, they all come back to, if you go back in time, sort of 18th century, they all come back to the place of Mansell, which you probably know, which is just north of Kirby Lonsdale. And there's Mansell Hall up here somewhere. There's Barben, so Kirby Lonsdale is down, and there's Mansell Hall, Kirby Lonsdale is down here, and they all come from there. So they're all related. And our wonderful good man, Methodist superhero, James Manser, actually had a second cousin who was not a good man or a superhero. He was a man called Lawrence Manser. Did we give his card out?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Lawrence. And I'm surprised you're going to admit to that. Now, Lawrence was the youngest of 5 children to a chap called Richard Manser and a woman called Margaret Lambert, and they came from just south of Kirby Lonsdale. His dad died just after Lawrence was born, so that's probably his excuse for being a naughty boy. He married a girl called Mary Bowman. Did Mary Bowman go out? I can't see it. Mary Bowman, anyone?
Yes, me.
Yes, right. So you two are married.
Very nice,
And you came from Kirby Stephen. Now, you'd been working in domestic service when you met, and they actually lived in Settle just after they got married, and you had a daughter called Margaret who unfortunately died in infancy and is buried in Holy Ascension Graveyard, which is how I got onto you. Then you moved to Bentham and had a son called Harry, and then you moved to Keighley and had a son called Frank and a daughter called Mary. And Lawrence was working as a coachman. So far so good, just making some money, enough to survive, absolutely fine. However, in 1887, which is quite a bit later, things didn't work out quite so well because this was found in the paper. Attempt to murder by starvation. At Leeds Societies, Lawrence Manser, aged 50, groom, living at Todmorden, he sort of varies between Todmorden and Keighley, had been indicted for attempting to murder his wife by starvation. The evidence, which disclosed a revolting state of things, showed that the prisoner had been married to his second wife, she was his second wife, for 20 years. 2 years ago, she had attacks of paralysis and epilepsy, which disabled her. She'd had a stroke. From this time, the prisoner neglected her altogether, and she depended on such food as the neighbours were unable to give her. She was repeatedly heard crying for food, and the prisoner did all he could to prevent the neighbours assisting her. Now, this is only the press saying this, you know, you don't know reality, do you? She had been allowed to lie in one position for so long her limbs were permanently crippled. He's not a nice man, is he? No. The attention of the authorities was ultimately called to the case, and the poor woman was removed to the workhouse, apparently in a dying condition. The prisoner was earning good wages, but having connected with another woman. He frequently told his wife to get forward with a dying, as he was anxious to marry again. The jury found the prisoner guilty, and the judge regretted that recent legislation had not contemplated the possibility of a man being so devoid of common humanity as the prisoner had been. Consequently, he could not deal adequately with the case. He should give the utmost sentence the law allowed, namely 2 years in prison. So naughty Lawrence. Understandably, there were many newspaper articles of this. I'm not going to read all of this, but just at the bottom here, prisoner is well known in the town, having been in the service of the magistrate's clerk for about 7 years. So he's earning decent money. You know, there's no reason why he couldn't look after his wife, but obviously another article said he'd just taken out life insurance on her as well. So, not a good boy, I think it's fair to say. good. So he's going to go. This was in 1887. Okay. So he's going to go to prison. He's going to Armley Jail in Leeds. Is where he's going to. And there's his conviction, his criminal records, feloniously withholding food, nourishment and clothing from his wife and keeping her in a damp, unwholesome room with intent to kill and murder in the months of November and December 1886. Not a nice man, not a nice man. However, while he's in prison, I think he gets his comeuppance. Well, in some ways. Sensational occurrences are unhappily becoming frequent in the erstwhile quiet, industrious borough of Leeds. Since when was Leeds? Well, since when was Leeds erstwhile quiet, industrious? Anyway, and now another tragedy, rendered all the more peculiar and horrifying by reason of its locality, has to be added to the list. All Leeds, every single bit of Leeds, was ringing on Saturday with the intelligence that at a late hour on the previous night a murder had taken place at Armley Jail. It isn't Lawrence. So what's going on? Right, there was another fellow criminal in the prison who I don't think we got out, have we, called William Sissons?
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
Are you William Sissons?
Yeah.
Yes. Complete in your convict uniform? Yes, in your convict uniform. Now, he killed somebody, but was clearly suffering from mental health issues. He was certified to be a dangerous lunatic. And basically, the authorities decided he was a dangerous lunatic. We're going to have to move him to Broadmoor. And pending the discharge of some legal formalities before he could be removed to Broadmoor, the jail officials decided to place Sissons in a cell with two of the prisoners who were to act as watchers. So you've got a murderer with mental health problems. What shall we do? Oh, let's stick him in with two of the prisoners. The men were selected for this onerous duty were James Edward Taylor of Bradford, said to be the son of a surgeon at one time of good position, who was serving time for theft of books, and Lawrence Manser. He doesn't tell us all the rest of his gory details, but anyway. It seems that Sissons had a fit about 5 o'clock on Friday, but soon recovered. And after the evening meal had been partaken of, went to bed, as also did his watchers. Taylor went to sleep, that's the other watcher, but the other watcher, our Lawrence, remained awake. Just before 10 o'clock, Manser heard a short cough. Turning round, he saw Sissons, who previously had appeared to be asleep, and who was a powerfully built man, standing over Taylor with a three-legged stool in both hands, raised above his head. Manser instantly sprang out of bed to see Sissons, but before he had time to do this, Sissons had brought down the stool with terrific force on the right side of Taylor's head. The skull was fractured and death occurred almost instantaneously. Manser at once closed with Sissons and, having taken the stool from him, managed to get to the bell pull, and raise an alarm. The murderer struggled desperately, the light being knocked out in the course of the tussle, but Manser, a stalwart young man, he's 50, succeeded in overpowering him and so holding him down until the arrival of several warders. I think he had a lucky escape, don't you?
Yeah. You did well.
So, like a teacher, weren't he?
I reckon Manfred
Anyway, so he didn't die. He didn't die. But anyway, I just think it says so much about the prison system in those days that that's what you're going to do with someone who's certified insane. Oh, we can't move him yet, we'll stick him anyway. So, did this whole prison thing help to reform Lawrence's ways? His wife, the poor Mary, was still alive. She hadn't died yet. She'd gone to the workhouse and they'd actually looked after him better than Lawrence did. Anyway, he gets out of prison, having served his 2 years in 1889, and goes back to live with Mary at home. She's now back home. So, is he a reformed character? Just after he's come out in July 1889. In January 1890, 6 months later, this was in the news. Alleged neglect of wife and family. Lawrence Manser, coachman, who was apprehended at Shipley during the week, was put in the box on charge of deserting his wife and allowing her to become chargeable to the Common Fund of Toppenden Union. So he's deserted her again, refusing to pay his fees at the workhouse. Anyway, he did actually cough up and she went to the workhouse. So that was January 1890, and poor old Mary eventually did die a year later. Bless her cotton socks. So Lawrence is now a free man. In the 1891 census, he is not living with anybody else, he's by himself, just as a coachman. However, 1893, he does marry again. And here he is in the following census, living with a new wife called Elizabeth. Now she's 54, he says he's 54, he's actually 65. But we know he's coming across as a very young man from what he said in prison. He obviously just gifted a gab and all the rest of it. She was a widow, her husband had died before as well. She was a widow from Nottinghamshire. And you can see here, Lawrence is listed as a manager of a tramway.